Welcome and thank you for attending this installation of our preservation workshop series. Our topic for today is tips for displaying historical materials. My name is Catherine Whalen. I am the Special Collections Supervisor at the Davenport Public Library. In this presentation, we'll be discussing the best ways for displaying historical materials and family heirlooms in your collections and that you want to display for the public. This is a continuation of our last preservation workshop, specifically the demystifying archival products, because those wishing to frame their artifacts will need to become familiar with archival terminology that we discussed last time. And we'll be using these terms and we'll be applying these terms in a slightly different fashion than we did last time for just storage and things like that. But this will be for displaying our materials instead. So we'll jump into what we'll be talking about today. So what is archival framing? It can be seen as the collection of materials and methods that promote the long-term condition or health of an artwork or artifact on display by controlling environmental threats to its preservation, including humidity, temperature, light, and dust. So those are the big external pests and threats that can impact the longevity of our materials. So those are the proper guidelines that we want to try and follow when doing these things. And so another thing to become familiar with, in addition with archival framing, is the actual structure of the frame itself, the components that we'll be using to display the materials. So this is a really great image from the Library of Congress's website on preservation under their collections care subheading. And it's just the components of preservation mat and frame package. And so this is kind of essentially what your artifact will look like after it's been treated and had these actions done to it. So you'll have your frame, which makes sense. The glazing, which is the glass or the acrylic, which we'll be talking about a little bit more in detail. The window mat, the backboard mat, where your back of your artwork will be. The hinges, there can be a linen tape strip that's holding the mat and the board together. Sometimes folks have a moisture barrier in there. There's also a backboard, and then some folks, if there's enough space along with the backboard, they'll also have a dust cover. But those are some key terms that you'll want to become familiar with, along with a word that I didn't really know until I was doing this, is the rabbet. And so a rabbet is a step-shaped recess cut along the edge or in the face of a piece of a wood, typically forming to match an edge or a tongue of another piece. So it's kind of that groove where everything sits. And so we'll be going into more detail with how big your rabbet should be for your framed archival object in later slides. But one note that I'd like to make is that long-term permanent display of paper-based materials is not always recommended because of light exposure, which causes permanent damage that is manifested or evident in fading, yellowing, embrittlement, and other irreversible changes to the item. So in our the best alternative that we can offer is to keep the original materials in good storage conditions and then to mat and frame a well-made reproduction. But when that is not the case, these are some steps that you can take to make your material last as long as it can in a display setting. So we'll jump into some general tips for what you should be doing when you're trying to frame an artwork or artifact for your home or for display at your business or museum or library. So the first and largest tip that we can give is to leave no trace or do no harm. This is to say, don't use any adhesives or materials that are irreversible. So you'll want to make sure that they are reversible, that they can be dissolved in water, that they can be removed without leaving a trace of it being there. You don't want to use just regular Scotch tape because that will end up flaking off and leaving an acidic strip on your material. You don't want to mount your artifact onto the back of your board because that's permanent. You can't ever get that item off of there, things like that. And then we recommend that all mats and backing materials and adhesives should be chemically stable and acid-free. So like in previous sessions, we want to make sure that those plastics or adhesives are stable. A good note for plastics, if they smell like plastic, they're not probably chemically stable. So you should avoid those. And we'll go over touch on some plastics that should work for you when framing your materials. And then select a frame that is of an appropriate size for the material being framed. You don't want to have a tiny item in a large frame that's going to kind of not really fit or be supported in the proper way within that frame. And you can, there's some really great resources that we'll be sharing in the later slides that you can go, and they talk specifically about choosing a frame that will match your material the most appropriately. Select the proper hardware. So you'll want to make sure that you have the proper hardware because you don't want any possible slippage from wherever you hang the item. You don't want to cause any strain on the frame, things like that. That will help it have a secure spot for a long time. And then as appropriate, use cotton gloves when handling materials to keep from soiling paper. Clean hands are also best for dexterity. So it just depends on the types of materials that you're trying to frame and their fragility. So if you have a really fragile, flaking paper item, I'd probably not use gloves just because you could catch and tear on those existing fragments. But if it's a photograph that's in good condition, then you can use gloves to not get fingerprints or smudges onto the emulsion layer of the item. And so there's a couple items that we would potentially frame in our department, and one is actually a painting up in the top corner, and then a rendering of a building, and then a photograph, and then a architectural drawing of our Fedgerberry Park. So some fun things in there, but those are our general tips, and there'll be more tips throughout this presentation. So the mat and board. So for mats, you'll want to use cotton, rag, or lignin-free wood pulp stock paper. Those should be acceptable for mats, especially because they'll be touching the part of your historical item. As for the backing board, you'll want to use corrugated board that's acid-free, corrugated polypropylene that's at least 3 millimeters thick to give it good supporting back layer, or there are also materials that have paper surface layers, and then a central foam layer. So you could also use foam, a type of foam core too. Just make sure that they're all stable chemically. You can do whichever one you feel would be the best and most appropriate for that item, and then also the frame. So there's other things to consider with the mats and the boards, is that you can either do a pH neutral paper that has nothing added to it, or a slightly alkaline paper, which is just buffered. This is buffered with calcium carbonate. So depending on the materials that you are framing and wanting to display, look into that and see if a buffered mat board is appropriate, or if it's not, just go with a pH neutral. That should help the material just the same. And you'll want to pay attention to the thickness of the mats and also the backboard. So for the mats, you'll want to at least get 4-ply minimum thickness of paper. This will provide some surface protection from the glazing for the item, so it doesn't touch the glass or the acrylic, and it'll just provide a little buffer for it. In addition, as you're working with this, so you can either tell the framing company that you want to frame your item these things, or you can try this on your own. There's materials and resources out there that you can learn how to match your own archival artifacts. But if you do it on your own, try and save the cutout from the cutting out of the window mats, the mat that goes around your item for viewing. And then also plan out the cuts from largest to smallest to get the most use out of each board. And don't dispose of the remaining strips, because these can be used in other projects for dividers or stiffeners for materials that are might need a little bit of strength for not falling over, things like that. That's really good for smaller items. So some other notes is that the backing board will be used not only to keep your mounting secure, but also to keep out pollutants and insects as well, those pests that we don't want accessing our valuable artifacts. This should be a well-fitting piece of corrugated board, and it can be sealed with stable tape. And so that'll keep out the dust, things like that. And some of us already have a lot of framed and matted items. If you do, check the edges of the window, the mat window, and the back of the board for browning or foxing, which is a flecking of dots. They look like little brown flecks or a little pattern forming. This can indicate that the mat board and the mat and the backing boards are made out of inferior materials that might have acid in them or transfer other things that we don't want to our materials. And so reframing is typically recommended in those situations, but it depends on how they did the framing in the first place. If they've mounted the physical item onto the backing board permanently, then we might be able to only change out the mats or change out one or the other. So it just depends on your situation. But then we'll go into the hinges. So hinges are going to be what you attach the item to the backing board with. And so materials should never be mounted on the back or with adhesives such as dry mount that's permanent and irreversible. Smaller items can be fixed with some of these items, like our acid-free corners or transparent mounting strips. Larger items can be fixed with Japanese paper and starch adhesives, but to kind of cover the basic types of hinge materials that you should be trying to use are our Japanese paper and wheat paste starch. So those two are probably highly recommended in the field just because they are dissolvable in water. So they don't leave a trace, but some materials might actually buckle or warp when using the wheat starch paste, just because it is a wet material and it has to dry. And so you'll have to be aware if the item can curl or buckle, to not use that or not use as much, and try testing it out before you use that one for all materials. Then we have our mylar and or polypropylene straps. These can be attached with acid-free tapes, and then create like little supports for mounting the materials. There's mounting strips that can be used as well, photo or mounting corners. So if you've seen in some scrapbooks that they have little corners on the items, that might be good for materials that are a little bit more fragile, that can be used with those materials. So some other stuff to consider are our shapes for our Japanese paper hinges. So there's two main types, the T hinge and the V hinge. And so the T hinge has a tab that extends beyond the edge of the paper. Another strip of acid-free paper is then placed on top of the tab and then is attached to the support material. And an overmat that covers the edges of the paper must be used to conceal this type of hinge. So this is only if you can cover up this type of hinge for this type of support, you can use this. And then there's the second, which is the folded or the V hinge. This is more discreet because it is implied entirely under the edge of the paper. Here, in this instance, a small strip of acid-free paper is then folded in half to form a sort of a tent. One half of the tent adheres to the back of the artwork, and then the other is to the mounting board. So this method works well when artworks are floated, that is when the entire paper is visible, so there's no window mat over top of the item. But if you do have the window mat, the T-strip, the T-hinge might work best for you. And there are lots of instructions out there for creating both of these. We're just kind of covering the basics in this presentation. So we might show you how to use those hinges in the future. Then we're on to glazing. And so a glaze is just that piece of glass or acrylic that is the first thing in the frame. So that's the glazing. So you can choose glass, acrylic, or polypropylene. Some characteristics for glass are that it provides a lot of clarity, sometimes glare, if you use that. And then it also has a possibility of breakage. So some folks, depending on the size of the frame, you don't want to use a big chunk of glass for a large frame that might fall or have an accident some other way. You might want to use a piece of acrylic or polypropylene, which they can have lighter weight. They're not always as clear or have, they sometimes have opaque qualities. Things to be concerned with acrylic or polypropylene is that it has a static quality to it that should not be used with charcoal, pastel, or any other mediums that have particles that may pull you loose from the surface of the paper. So when you're trying to frame a pastel done by your grandma or grandpa, don't use acrylic for that, use glass, or you can also buy acrylic or polypropylene that's anti-static. So you just have to kind of weigh your pros and cons. And it's also really a personal choice based on the price, the type of frame that you have, things like that, and the size of the item. Then another thing to consider is to have a UV protective coat on your glass or acrylic or polypropylene or not. So there's options for both, but this really depends on where the item is going to be hung and the light sources around that spot. So if your item is going to be hung in a hallway without too many chances of having light sources on for long times, or if it's going to be hung in a really bright kitchen or a living room, you might want to choose one with UV protection, whereas the other one you wouldn't. But it just depends. And there were recommendations that if you did use the UV protective coating for your on your glazing, to check it every 10 to 12 years just to make sure that the coating isn't degrading or causing any damage to your items. And you want to kind of continually look at your item just to make sure that it's in its best condition. Then be sure when you do choose your glazing to clean the inside of the glazing before closing the frame to avoid trapping any unwanted particles in there. And then, like these paintings in the image here, you do not have to use glazing if a painting has been varnished, because that's already a coating over top of the framed item or the artwork. So that doesn't necessarily require glass or acrylic, but if you choose to, you can. You just have to kind of weigh your pros and cons for that. Then, as for frames, so this is a big topic. There's multiple types of frames out there. We'll just be covering wood and metal. You can choose either one, and it's definitely like the last choice for glazing. It's a personal choice and what matches the items the best. So for wood, we suggest that hardwood is preferable, whereas the softwoods contain more acid and may leach into your mounting board and then into your item. So you might want to avoid those a little bit more than the hardwoods. You can also choose metal. It just depends on the style and that you're seeking for your framed object and what will allow it to spark and look the best, and also to be preserved the best. So some questions to ask oneself about what kind of frame might be best for your needs are: what color? So do we want the warm or cool tones in the frame? What's the frame profile? What does the frame match the item being framed? Also, you also should look at how deep the rabbet is to accommodate the thickness of the mat, the backing board, and the glazing material, because those are all really important. And I did skip over like choosing, because you can choose mat boards in different colors. It's really a personal preference. I would probably just go with white, just because that's easy to notice if there's any damage to the item and if anything's wrong, and you can really let the item speak for itself. But look at all those things when you're selecting a frame, and then you should be able to choose a really good one. Then, where to hang your historical materials. So we have some recommendations for preferred spots to hang your or store your framed objects. We suggest out of direct sunlight or any light source, particularly intense light source, because we don't want items to have sustained access to light sources. So try and avoid those things. Place them away from working fireplaces or heat sources like radiators, because that can cause damage, drying and flaking and things like that. And also yellowing sometimes. Away from intake or exhaust vents, because that can introduce dust to the environment, other pollutants. We suggest that you hang them on interior walls instead of exterior walls, because the exterior walls may experience temperature fluctuations and may hold more moisture that might leach into the item. We suggest storing them out of attics, basements, or other areas that are prone to environmental extremes and that also have a high risk for water damage, to avoid those. And then also store them off the floor. If you can prop them up on something so that pests don't get access to them, or if there's flooding, you can avoid that as well. Then here are some recommended archival framing sites. So Library of Congress has a really great guide for conservation framing. The Image Permanence Institute has a really great guide for lots of different types of materials, but they do have a little publication that you can use for helping you to frame your items. Mr. Joshua Cripps has a really great blog and video on how to mat a print in archival conservation safe manner. Nielsen Bainbridge talks about some archival framing techniques. And then the Archival Methods blog, DIY Archival Framing, that has a really great recommendations for actually choosing your frame and how to go about that. And it has good recommendations for the types of frames, some framing companies that you might want to look at, and then some considerations to making those decisions about what frame to choose. And then we have our bibliography. Thank you to all the folks that have done really great research out there before and have such great resources available to folks. Frame Destination is also a really good resource for posing questions on what frame to choose. But all these sites have really good information. They all emphasize do no harm and try and enjoy your material while you have them. But I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Again, if you have any questions, want recommendations, you can contact us at our special collections at davenportlibrary.com email or my email, or call us. We have some great resources on our websites, and follow us on social media. And thank you so much, and join us next time for the preservation workshop.